The Hamilton Mansion stood proudly in Boston's exclusive Beacon Hill neighborhood. The magnificent stone house was a striking presence even among the surrounding mansions. Eleanor Hamilton was the lady of the house and a well-known figure in Boston society. Political leaders and business executives always made appearances at the charity events she hosted. Her perfectly styled silver hair and consistently straight posture reflected her unwavering confidence and status. Deborah was born as Eleanor's eldest daughter. But now, she was walking a path far from what her mother had envisioned. She had chosen to live with her husband and son in a modest single-family home in a middle-class neighborhood. "You could have had a much more suitable life," Eleanor would say, shaking her head. How many times had Deborah witnessed this? Her mother continued to lament her eldest daughter's failure while bitterly stirring her Earl Grey tea with a silver teaspoon. When Deborah refused to attend medical school at a prestigious university and decided to become a nurse, Eleanor didn't speak to her for a week. And when she announced her marriage to Michael Watson, a newcomer at an architectural firm, her mother declared it a disgrace to the family. "Marrying a man with neither money nor connections, Deborah, you don't understand your own worth." Eleanor didn't appear at the wedding. Only her sister Jessica showed up, wearing a cold smile throughout the ceremony, not even trying to hide her satisfaction at finally having the upper hand over her sister. Jessica was living the life her mother had expected. She graduated from a prestigious school with excellent grades and made a name for herself as a high-end real estate agent, becoming her mother's pride. Hearing about Jessica's new successes during their weekly Sunday brunch had become Eleanor's joy. "Oh, Jessica, you sold another Manhattan penthouse? Wonderful." Deborah hadn't heard such mother-daughter conversations for years. Her relationship with her mother grew even colder after Elliot was born. Elliot, Deborah and Michael's son, had just celebrated his 8th birthday. His large brown eyes were inherited from his father, and his curious personality resembled his mother's. Elliot was good at drawing, and Deborah had plastered all his artwork inside her locker at the hospital. "Mom, isn't Grandma coming again?" Elliot asked on Christmas morning. Deborah could only stroke her son's head and answer, "Grandma is very busy." In truth, Eleanor had met Elliot only once, right after he was born, and afterward merely sent cold cards on his birthdays. Elliot was diagnosed with leukemia 2 weeks after his 8th birthday. Deborah took her son to another doctor for a second opinion, but the diagnosis remained unchanged. "It's acute lymphoblastic leukemia. We need to begin treatment immediately." Upon hearing those words, Deborah's world collapsed. Michael embraced her, and they both cried. Then they vowed to do their best for Elliot. Deborah called her mother. She thought it was time to set aside her pride for her son's sake, despite being essentially estranged for years. "Mother, Elliot has been diagnosed with leukemia." There was a moment of silence on the other end of the phone. "That's unfortunate," Eleanor's voice was emotionless. "Is there anything I can do?" "I'm worried about the treatment costs." "Money talk," Eleanor sighed. "I'll send some over for now." That was the entirety of their conversation. As promised, a deposit appeared in Deborah's account the next day. But there was no further contact. Elliot's treatment was harsh and painful. Deborah adjusted her work schedule to be by her son's side as much as possible. Michael also visited the hospital between his work commitments. They were desperate. Yet, Elliot's body grew weaker by the day. As his condition worsened, Deborah contacted her mother again, this time to ask about treatment options. She knew Eleanor had many connections in the medical field. "I was wondering if there might be any new treatments. Could you introduce me to a specialist?" "Deborah, I don't have time for this. There's a gala in Newport this weekend. Jessica will be accompanying me." Hearing that cold response, Deborah hung up. Tears streamed down her cheeks. She had no choice but to face this alone. Elliot fought bravely but couldn't overcome the disease. When he took his last breath, Deborah and Michael were in the hospital room. His small body looked as if it were peacefully sleeping. Funeral preparations began. Deborah stared at the small white coffin, asking God why she had to bury her child before herself. Surprisingly, Eleanor and Jessica contacted her saying they would attend the funeral. "Of course I'll come. Formalities are important regardless of the circumstances." Deborah couldn't respond to Eleanor's words. The soft light of dusk filtered into the living room filled with memories of her son. Deborah stood by the window, gazing at the quiet neighborhood outside. Tomorrow, black cars would line this peaceful street, and people would gather to bid farewell to her 8-year-old son. Michael was making coffee in the kitchen. Not knowing what to say to his wife, all he could do was be by her side. Deborah's grief was too deep to be consoled with words. "Debbie, maybe you should get some rest," Michael gently placed his hand on her shoulder. Deborah shook her head. "I can't sleep. I keep seeing Elliot's face." They were drinking coffee in silence when the doorbell rang. When Michael opened the door, Eleanor and Jessica were standing there. "Mother, Jessica," Deborah couldn't hide her surprise. She hadn't heard they would arrive the day before. "We finished checking into the hotel early, so we thought we'd stop by," Eleanor said, her eyes scanning the interior. Her gaze moved as if assessing the modest furniture in the room. Jessica was dressed in a black designer suit, as if she had come for an important business meeting. Upon seeing Deborah, she put on a thin veneer of sympathy. "Deborah, it must have been so difficult." There was no sincerity in her words. Jessica had never met Elliot. She hadn't remembered her nephew's birthdays or Christmases. Eleanor took out a handkerchief from her expensive handbag. "Such a sad thing to happen." Her voice sounded emotional, but Deborah could see through the act. Her mother had never once visited her grandson during his illness. "Would you like something to drink?" Michael offered, trying to ease the tense atmosphere. "Thank you, wine if you have it," Eleanor replied as if it were a given. Deborah silently headed to the kitchen and took out wine glasses. At that moment, vivid memories of her final days with Elliot in the hospital came flooding back. Her son had always tried to smile for his mother, even while enduring pain. "Mom, don't cry. I'll be okay." On his last day, Elliot pointed to the sky visible from the hospital room window and said, "Doesn't that cloud look like a sheep? Someday, I'll watch over you and Dad from the sky." Deborah felt her chest tighten at the memory. She returned to the living room and offered wine to her mother and Jessica. "What time tomorrow?" Jessica asked, taking out her smartphone. 10 o'clock, Deborah answered. "At a small church, just with close friends." "Oh, how quaint," Eleanor sighed. "You could have invited more of our acquaintances." Deborah felt anger at those words but simply gripped her glass tightly. She stood up and said, "I'm going to organize Elliot's room a bit, before heading upstairs." When she opened the door to her son's room, Elliot's presence was still strong there. Model spaceships, favorite books, and drawings on the wall. Deborah sat on her son's bed and picked up a small stuffed animal. "Eli, Mommy misses you," she whispered. On the desk was a drawing Elliot had been working on. It showed his family, Deborah, Michael, and himself. His maternal grandmother and aunt were not included. As Deborah was organizing the drawers, she found an envelope. It was addressed to Father Thomas, with "it to be opened at my funeral" written below in childish handwriting. She held the envelope, staring at it with trembling hands. Had Elliot sensed his own death coming? Tears streamed down Deborah's cheeks. She could hear Jessica's laughter from downstairs. Deborah quietly left the room and started down the stairs. When she paused halfway, she overheard her mother and sister's conversation from the living room. "Finally, this nuisance will be over," Eleanor's voice said. "Deborah can get back to a normal life now," Jessica replied. "She must have had a tough time living at the hospital all this time. She shouldn't have married that man in the first place. Now they're probably drowning in debt from Elliot's treatment costs. Won't they get insurance money?" "Oh, yes. That should help them." Deborah was speechless. Her mother and sister were calling her son's death a nuisance and talking about insurance money. She pressed her hand against the pain in her chest while firmly gripping Elliot's letter. She would give it to the priest at tomorrow's funeral. She must honor her son's final wish. Deborah proceeded to the living room. Looking up, she noticed that Eleanor and Jessica's conversation had suddenly stopped. The two smiled as if to cover up. "Deborah, you should rest now since tomorrow will be an early day," Eleanor told her daughter. "Yes, I will," Deborah replied coldly. "Why don't you two leave now?" That night, Deborah lay awake staring at the ceiling while Michael breathed peacefully beside her. She was uncertain whether to tell her husband about their son's letter. Deborah closed her eyes. She needed to prepare to say the final to her son tomorrow. And she must face the truth behind her mother and sister's masks. Morning light gently filtered through the stained glass windows of the church. The small white coffin was placed in front of the altar, surrounded by white lilies and blue balloon flowers that Elliot had loved. Deborah observed the scene from a distance, unable to believe it was real. Michael placed his hand on her arm and gently asked, "Ready?" Deborah nodded silently and squeezed her husband's hand tightly. The church was filled with family friends, hospital colleagues, Elliot's doctor, and neighbors. Everyone wore expressions of sorrow, mourning the too early departure of a young life. Eleanor and Jessica sat in the front row of the church. Eleanor wore a black veil and occasionally made gestures of pressing a handkerchief to her eyes. Jessica had placed her smartphone on her knee and was checking the screen from time to time. Both appeared to be grieving deeply, completely contradicting the conversation Deborah had overheard the night before. Father Thomas stood at the podium, and the funeral began. "Today, we have gathered to honor the life of Elliot Watson and pray for the peaceful journey of his soul." As the priest's words echoed through the church, Deborah recalled the days spent with her son. Elliot's first words, his first steps, and his innocent smile. The 8 short years had been days filled with love, like precious treasures. After the hymns were sung, Michael stood at the podium and spoke about his feelings for his son. "Elliot was the greatest gift to me and my wife. His smile brought light to our home, and his courage made us stronger. Son, you will continue to live in our hearts now and forever." Michael's voice trembled with his final words, and he touched the small coffin before leaving the podium. Next, Deborah stood up. She had forgotten the words she had prepared and simply expressed the thoughts overflowing from her heart. "Elliot, Mom was happy to see you every day. Your courage, your kindness, your intelligence. All of it made me proud. I will never forget how you fought against your illness and kept smiling until the end." Deborah's voice choked, and tears ran down her cheeks. "The days you gave me were the most beautiful time of my life. I love you, Elliot. Always." As she was about to return to her seat, Father Thomas approached her. "Mrs. Deborah, say your final to your son," he said, pointing to the small coffin. Deborah slowly walked to the coffin and placed a single white rose on it. As she wiped her tear-stained cheeks, Eleanor stood beside her. Her mother whispered in her ear, "You should never have had this child in the first place." Deborah froze. She held her breath and looked up at her mother's face. There was a cold light in Eleanor's eyes. As Michael tried to move closer to his wife, Jessica held up her smartphone with a smile. The sound of a camera shutter echoed in the quiet church. "Your crying face is quite the spectacle," Jessica cruelly remarked. Deborah stared at them in disbelief. Her body trembled with anger and sorrow. Michael supported her, asking with concern, "Debbie, are you okay?" At that moment, Father Thomas quietly spoke up. "Everyone, please return to your seats. I have something that Elliot entrusted to me." Deborah remembered the envelope she had found the night before. She looked at the priest. He took out the envelope handed to him by Deborah and quietly opened it. This letter was written by Elliot before his passing. The church fell silent. The color drained from Eleanor and Jessica's faces. They exchanged anxious glances. "Dear everyone," Father Thomas began reading Elliot's letter. "When I'm writing this letter, it's very sunny outside, and I can see the blue sky through the window. Mom and Dad have always been by my side. But I know I won't live long. Deborah's heart ached. She hadn't known her son harbored such thoughts. I love Mom and Dad very much. They have always loved me. But Grandma and Aunt Jessica are different. Eleanor and Jessica stiffened. The attendees began to look at them. While I was in the hospital, Grandma and Aunt Jessica never came to visit me. Moreover, I overheard them talking. In the hospital hallway, they called me at the burden. Gasps rose from the congregation. Though shocked, Deborah somehow found it unsurprising. She recalled the conversation she had overheard last night. The priest continued, I also heard Grandma saying I was the child who ruined Deborah's life. And that they would benefit from the insurance money when I died. Michael rose, shaking with anger. What? One day, I recorded their conversation, Elliot's letter continued. I didn't show it to Mom and Dad, but I saved the recording on a USB drive and left it with this letter. Father Thomas, please let everyone listen to it. Father Thomas hesitated momentarily while holding the letter, but then produced a small USB drive. When he connected it to the church's speaker system, Eleanor and Jessica's voices echoed throughout the church. When Elliot dies, Deborah and Michael will finally be free, Eleanor's cold voice. They'll get the insurance money, so we won't need to cover their debts, Jessica's calculating tone. Honestly, that child should never have been born in the first place. It's that child and his father who ruined Deborah's life. When the recording ended, the church was completely silent. Deborah covered her face with trembling hands, and Michael embraced his wife. Father Thomas removed the USB and resumed reading Elliot's letter. But I'm okay. Because Mom and Dad love me. When I go to heaven, I'll always watch over Mom and Dad. And to Grandma and Aunt Jessica, I want to say this, I don't hold a grudge against you. But I want you to know that real family is bound by love, not money or honor. Eleanor and Jessica remained seated, trying to escape everyone's gaze. Eleanor's makeup was ruined, and Jessica clutched her smartphone with trembling hands. Deborah stood up and approached the coffin. She touched her son's photo and said softly, Elliot, thank you. You gave us strength until the very end. She slowly turned toward her mother and sister. You are no longer my family. Eleanor tried to stand up but sat back down, crushed by the cold stares around her. Jessica headed toward the church exit as if escaping. Outside, rain had begun to fall. Among the people surrounding the small white coffin, Deborah cried from the bottom of her heart for the first time. It wasn't just sorrow but also a sense of liberation as the truth came to light. Elliot had given her the gift of truth as his final present. The silence in the church was heavy and suffocating. Deborah and Michael sat in the front row chairs, listening as the priest continued reading the letter. Elliot's words were filled with deep insight and wisdom that seemed beyond his small body. There's a bit more to this letter, Father Thomas said. His voice was mixed with sadness and anger. To Mom and Dad, the priest continued reading. Don't be sad when I go to heaven. I was very happy. But there's something I want you to know about Grandma and Aunt Jessica. Eleanor sank into her chair, and Jessica tried to head for the exit, but Michael's friends quietly blocked her way. There was no escape. Grandma and Aunt Jessica went to Dad's office while Mom was at the hospital, talking about the money they sent for my treatment. I was there and overheard their conversation. Deborah looked at her husband in surprise. Michael's expression hardened. They were saying, have half of the treatment money we sent to Deborah put into our account. They said, she won't check the details. Dad got angry and told them to get out. I was in the hallway and heard everything. The attendees looked at Eleanor and Jessica with shocked expressions. Tears streamed down Deborah's cheeks. She gripped her husband's hand. And one more thing, the priest continued. They were also talking about my insurance. When Mom took out insurance for me, Grandma said, put my name as one of the beneficiaries, I'll manage it for Elliot when you become emotionally unstable. But that was a lie. Eleanor had now completely collapsed. Her noble demeanor was gone, leaving only the figure of an elderly woman. The USB contains more recordings of Grandma and Aunt Jessica talking about my illness. They called me a burden and Deborah's weight. And they were planning how to use the insurance money after I died. Going on trips, buying a new car. Michael stood up, trembling with anger. You were planning to profit from our son's death. The atmosphere in the church was tense. Eleanor stood up, trying to explain. That's not true, Deborah. I was thinking of you. Be quiet. Deborah's voice shook. Now that Elliot has revealed the truth, your lies won't work anymore. The priest read the final part of Elliot's letter. But I forgive them. True family cherishes each other when they're together. Mom and Dad taught me that. I wanted Grandma and Aunt Jessica to know the warmth of such a family. The priest folded the letter and said quietly, I pay my respects to Elliot's pure heart and his courage. Knowing his own end was near, he tried to leave the truth for the people he loved. Deborah stood up and ascended the podium. Her voice was trembling but had regained its strength. Everyone, I am grateful for the truth my son left behind. Elliot gave us strength until the very end. She looked toward Eleanor and Jessica. The two were now completely isolated, shrinking under the cold stares of those around them. For a long time, I lived seeking approval from my mother and sister. I continued to hope they would love me. But now, through my son's brave action, I understand what true love is. Deborah extended her hand to Michael, who climbed onto the podium and stood beside his wife. We loved Elliot, and he loved us. That is a true family. Mother, Jessica, you no longer exist in our lives. Eleanor stood up and said in a trembling voice, Deborah, please. That's enough, Deborah said quietly. Please don't bring any more shame to my son's funeral. Jessica was crying. However, those weren't tears of remorse but tears of exposed disgrace. She hurriedly left the church. Eleanor, after a final glance at Deborah, followed her daughter. The funeral continued solemnly. As Elliot's small coffin was carried out of the church, the sun broke through the clouds, casting rainbow-colored light on the floor through the stained glass. Deborah saw this and smiled faintly. After the burial service at the cemetery, Deborah and Michael talked with Father Thomas. Elliot handed me the envelope a few days before he passed away, the priest explained. He said, there's something important, please show it to Mom and Dad. I didn't expect such contents. Father, how did my son look? Deborah asked. He was peaceful. He seemed calm, like an adult, with a sense of relief as if he had accomplished something. Deborah nodded. Elliot knew about my mother and sister. Things we didn't notice. Michael embraced his wife's shoulders. He was trying to protect us. A few days later, Deborah and Michael examined the USB's contents in detail. It contained multiple recordings of Eleanor and Jessica's conversations. They had embezzled nearly half the amount they had supposedly sent for Elliot's treatment costs, called the sick child a nuisance, and planned how to use the insurance money. Even more shocking was the evidence that Eleanor had withdrawn funds from a trust fund created for Deborah before her marriage and invested them in Jessica's business. Elliot had recorded his grandmother and aunt's conversations from his hospital bed using a smartphone. That child was watching us all along, Deborah said. Her voice was mixed with sorrow and pride. Elliot tried to protect us until the end, Michael embraced his wife. He is our hero. Deborah and Michael contacted a lawyer about the embezzlement of funds by Eleanor and Jessica. However, Deborah ultimately decided not to take legal action. I don't want to be involved with them anymore, she said. It's enough to know the truth Elliot taught us and to have cut them out of our lives. That night, Deborah was in her son's room, looking at his drawings. One showed Deborah, Michael, and Elliot himself standing hand in hand. In the sky were a large sun and small stars shining around it. Beneath the picture, in Elliot's childish handwriting, was written a true family. Deborah held the picture to her chest and cried. They were tears of sorrow but also tears of gratitude for her son's love and courage. A month passed. Deborah stood by the living room window, gazing at the young apple tree they had just planted in the garden. It was a memorial tree for Elliot. Apples had been his favorite fruit. She remembered him saying, "Mom, when I grow up, I want to grow an apple tree." Michael embraced her shoulders from behind. "How are you feeling?" "A little more settled." Deborah smiled faintly. "Yes. I'm still lonely, but I'm moving forward little by little." They were in the midst of grief over losing their son, but thanks to the gift of truth Elliot had left them, they could face that grief honestly. There were no more secrets or family entanglements, they could simply love and mourn their son purely. The local newspaper reported Eleanor Hamilton's fall from society. The recording from Elliot's funeral had circulated, and many friends and acquaintances cut ties with her. Jessica's real estate business rapidly lost clients, forcing her to close her office. Their once glamorous life had collapsed in an instant. Apology letters and phone calls from both women reached Deborah, but she ignored them all. Michael supported his wife's decision. They chose to live according to Deborah's words, "You no longer exist in our lives." Deborah returned to work and began to regain her routine as a nurse at the hospital. However, there was something unfulfilled. She read and reread the drawings and letters left in her son's room many times, engraving Elliot's thoughts in her heart. One morning, Deborah suddenly said to her husband, "I want to create a foundation for children fighting pediatric cancer." Michael looked at his wife in surprise, then smiled gently. "That's a wonderful idea. Elliot would be happy." They established a foundation called Elliot's Light. It was an organization to financially and emotionally support children with pediatric cancer and their families. They aimed to create an environment where children could be comfortable while receiving treatment, utilizing Deborah's nursing experience and Michael's architectural knowledge. In establishing the foundation, Deborah adopted Elliot's last words as the organization's philosophy: "True family is bound by love, not blood." This phrase was always included on the foundation's website and printed materials. 3 years later, the Elliot's Light Foundation became nationally known, bringing hope to many pediatric cancer patients and their families. Deborah and Michael had overcome their grief and were giving life to their sons by saving many lives. One day, while Deborah was working at the foundation's office, she received notice of a visitor from reception. Looking up, she saw Eleanor standing there. Her mother, who had aged rapidly, had lost her former arrogance and appeared to be just a frail elderly woman. "Deborah." Eleanor was at a loss for words. "I'm not asking for forgiveness. I just want to support your work." Deborah silently stared at her mother. There was no anger in her heart. She just realized that her mother's approval, which had once been so important, now held no meaning. "We accept donations to the foundation. Please complete the process at the reception," she said quietly. Eleanor teared up at Deborah's calm response. She nodded slightly and quietly left. That night, while looking at Elliot's photo, Deborah thought, though she hadn't asked Elliot to forgive, she continued to uphold his teachings, believing in the power of love. And she secretly harbored hope that one day, reconciliation with her mother might come. Elliot's final words, "True family is bound by love," now resonated in the hearts of many people, creating new bonds. His short life had not been an end but had become the beginning of many stories.